Well, keep your sentimental junk off my floor. And be faster about it. I have a $1 billion deal to close. I can't have the place smelling like a cheap diner.
The polished marble floor gleamed, reflecting the cold, indifferent lights of the skyscraper. For Elena, it was a mirror of a life she served but could never touch. Then, a careless flick of a wrist sent a river of hot black coffee splashing across her freshly mopped surface. It was the third time that week, and it came from him. Mr. Sterling, the CEO, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, staring at his phone, the source of his distraction, while the dark liquid pooled around his $1,000 shoes. He didn't look at her. He never did. He just sighed, a sound of pure annoyance, as if she were a bug on his windshield. "Clean it up," he said, his voice flat, bored. He didn't say please. He didn't say sorry. He just gave an order. Elena, all 58 years of her, felt something inside her clench. Her hands, worn from bleach and work, tightened on the handle of her mop. She knelt, the familiar ache in her knees a dull throb. The sharp, bitter smell of the coffee filled her nose. But as she started to wipe, a small silver locket she wore around her neck swung forward, tapping gently against the floor. Sterling's eyes finally dropped from his phone, not to her face, but to the locket. A smirk twisted his lips. "What's that? Some cheap trinket?" Elena froze. The locket was not a trinket. It was the only thing she had left. She looked up, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a boss, not as a powerful man, but just as a person. And she saw nothing. No kindness, no empathy, just cold, empty ambition. This was the pattern break. For 2 years she had been invisible, a ghost who cleaned up messes. But in that moment, as he insulted the one thing that held her husband's memory, she stopped being a ghost. A quiet fire, one she thought had died long ago, began to smolder in her chest. "It was a gift," she said, her voice soft but steady, refusing to break eye contact. Sterling scoffed, a truly ugly sound. "Right, well, keep your sentimental junk off my floor." He gestured to the coffee stain. "And be faster about it. I have a $1 billion deal to close. I can't have the place smelling like a cheap diner." He turned to walk away, but then stopped, turning back with a cruel glint in his eye. He was enjoying this. "You know," he said loud enough for a passing assistant to hear, "my father used to say you measure a company by its weakest link. Looking at you, I think we need to start making some cuts." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her job, her only income, the small apartment that was her only sanctuary. It was all tied to this floor, to this man who saw her as less than human. The assistant scurried away, her face a mask of pity and fear. Elena was alone again, kneeling in a puddle of someone else's mess, the smell of coffee now smelling like humiliation. Have you ever been made to feel that small? Pinned down by someone else's power, feeling like your entire world could be swept away by their bad mood? It's a terrible, helpless feeling, and right then, Elena felt the full weight of it. If you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued, hit that subscribe button right now. This story's for you, and trust me, you're going to want to see what happens next. That night, Elena didn't sleep. She sat in her small, quiet apartment, the city lights up distant, lonely glitter outside her window. The whole place smelled faintly of lavender, her only small luxury. On her bedside table was a framed photograph of a man with kind eyes and a wide, warm smile. His arm was wrapped around a younger Elena, her face bright with joy she barely remembered feeling. Her husband, Arthur. She opened the locket, the one Mr. Sterling had called a cheap trinket. Inside was a tiny version of that same photo. Arthur, her Arthur. He wasn't just a memory. He was the man who had built Sterling Innovations from the ground up in a dusty garage with nothing but a dream and calloused hands. He was the original Mr. Sterling. The man now running his company, the man who had her scrubbing his coffee spills, was Arthur's estranged son from a bitter first marriage. A boy who Arthur had tried and failed to connect with. A boy who had changed his last name back to Sterling only after Arthur had passed, eager to claim an empire he hadn't built. Arthur had been a different kind of CEO. He knew every employee's name, from the engineers to the mailroom clerks. He'd walk the floors, not to inspect, but to talk. He used to say, "A company isn't a building or a stock price, Elena, it's people. You take care of the people, the business takes care of itself." Now his son was planning to sell the company. She'd heard the whispers during her late-night shifts. Whispers in half-empty offices and from discarded notes in wastebaskets. He was planning to sell it to a competitor, a corporate raider known for gutting companies, laying off thousands and selling the pieces for scrap. He was going to erase Arthur's legacy for a quick, massive payout. Her husband's life's work gone. The people he cared about, jobless. All because of the arrogance of a man who saw a locket full of love and called it junk. The grief she carried every day was a heavy blanket, but tonight it wasn't just grief, it was anger. A righteous, protective anger, the kind a mother feels for a child, the kind a wife feels for her husband's honor. Arthur had made her promise on his deathbed to protect his real family, the employees of Sterling Innovations. He'd left everything to her, not just the memories, not just the locket, everything. A quiet resolve settled over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the fire was stronger. She picked up the phone and made a call she hadn't made in 2 years. "It's time," she said, her voice no longer soft, but forged in steel. The next morning, the air in the 40th floor boardroom was electric with tension. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the long, polished mahogany table. The board members, a collection of sharp suits and serious faces, murmured amongst themselves. They were here to vote on the acquisition. For them, it was a simple, if ruthless, business decision. A huge payday. Mr. Sterling strode in, radiating confidence. He was beaming, a shark smelling blood in the water. Today he would become legendarily wealthy. He would finally escape the shadow of a father he resented. He smoothed his tie, ready to take his seat at the head of the table. But someone was already sitting there. A woman. An older woman, in a simple, modest, but immaculately clean dress. Her silver hair was tied back neatly. Her hands, worn but steady, were folded on the table in front of her. It was the cleaner. A wave of confusion washed over the room. Board members exchanged baffled looks. Who was this? A protester? A mistake? Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. His confident smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure disbelief, which quickly curdled into rage. "What in the hell are you doing here?" he snarled, his voice a low growl. "Security!" Elena didn't flinch. She simply looked at him. That same quiet, steady gaze from the day before. But this time, it wasn't the gaze of a cleaner. It was the gaze of a queen. "Hello, James," she said, her voice calm and clear, echoing slightly in the stunned silence. She had used his real name, the one he had abandoned. Before he could explode, the heavy oak doors opened again. An older man in a crisp suit walked in. Arthur's longtime lawyer, Robert Vale. He placed a leather-bound portfolio on the table in front of Elena. "What is this?" Sterling demanded, his face turning a blotchy red. "What is the meaning of this?" Robert cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority, "allow me to introduce you to the chairwoman and majority shareholder of Sterling Innovations." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Mrs. Elena Sterling." Wait, what? The shock in the room was a physical force. Jaws literally dropped. Sterling looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He staggered back a step, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing and hearing. The cleaner? The old woman with the mop? His father's widow? He stared at the locket, which now rested against the fabric of her dress. The cheap trinket. He suddenly understood. It wasn't just a locket. It was a symbol. A crown he had never seen. This is the moment everything changes. Can you feel that? The shift in power, the delicious justice of it all? If your heart is pounding right now, go ahead and hit that like button for Elena. Let's show some love for the quiet ones who hold all the power. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Sterling's face had gone from red to a sickly pale white. He looked from Elena to the lawyer and back again, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. No, that's impossible. He left me the company. Elena finally spoke, her voice still quiet, but now it held the entire room captive. No, James. Arthur left you a generous trust fund and a position, hoping you would learn the value of his work. He left the company to me. She slid a document out of the portfolio, the last will and testament of Arthur Sterling. He trusted you to be a steward, not a destroyer. I have been watching, silently, for 2 years. I've mopped the floors of this building, yes, but I've also listened. I heard the engineers in the labs worried that your budget cuts were compromising safety. I saw the marketing team demoralized because you dismissed every idea that wasn't your own. I've emptied the trash cans filled with resumes from good people, loyal people looking for a way out. She wasn't just a cleaner. She had been a spy, hidden in plain sight, gathering intelligence from the ground up. She knew the health of the company better than anyone at that table. You see profit margins and stock prices, Elena said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned board members. Arthur saw a family. He built this company to create, to innovate, to provide for thousands of families. You are planning to sell it to Vulture Capital, a firm that will tear it to pieces, lay off everyone, and salt the earth behind them. All for your own vanity. One of the board members, a woman named Carol, who had known Arthur for years, looked at Sterling with dawning horror. Is this true, James? That's the deal on the table? Sterling couldn't speak. He was cornered, exposed. Elena didn't need him to answer. She slid another document across the table. It was the acquisition offer, a copy she'd recovered, ironically, from his own office trash can the night before. This is not an acquisition, Elena declared, her voice ringing with passion. This is a betrayal of your father's memory and a betrayal of every single person who works for this company. She then looked at each board member, one by one. Arthur put a clause in his will, a morality clause. It states that the controlling interest I hold is absolute, but can be passed to his son only if he proves to be a worthy successor, judged by a board that puts the company's founding principles first. But if he acts against the core interests of the company and its people, he forfeits everything. She let that sink in. Today was supposed to be your big payday, James. Instead, it's your performance review. Sterling finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate cry. You can't do this! I built this! I doubled the stock price! You built nothing, Elena said, her voice dropping to an icy calm.
You inherited a mansion and sold the furniture. You rode on the momentum of your father's hard work, and now you want to burn the whole house down for the insurance money. She stood up, no longer the meek cleaner, but a titan. She radiated an authority that came not from money or title, but from love, loss, and a deep, unshakable sense of justice. The vote to sell is off the table. She announced, "We will be voting on a new motion, the removal of James Sterling as CEO, effective immediately." She looked at him, the man who had mocked her, humiliated her, threatened her, and in her eyes there was no hatred. There was only a profound sadness, a deep, heartbreaking pity. "Your father loved you, James. He just wanted you to be a good man. That's all he ever wanted." The fight drained out of him. The mention of his father's love, the one thing he'd craved and rejected his whole life, was the final blow. He sank into a nearby chair, a broken man in a perfect suit. The vote was a formality, unanimous. The room was quiet again. The board members looked at Elena, waiting. What now? She walked around the table until she stood directly in front of him. He wouldn't look at her, staring instead at his own shaking hands. Elena reached down and picked up a water pitcher from the table. She walked over to a nearby potted plant and carefully, gently, began to water it. The sound of the water hitting the soil was the only sound in the room. "My husband used to say," she said, not looking at anyone in particular, "that you have to nurture things for them to grow. People, ideas, a company." She finished watering the plant and turned back to James. "You are not a bad man, James. Just a lost one. You wanted to prove you were better than your father, but you never understood what made him great. It wasn't the money, it was the heart." She paused, a full circle moment hanging in the air. The company needs a new CEO, someone who understands it from the ground up. But every floor needs to be cleaned. It's a place to start, a place to learn humility, a place to see the people your father cared about. She gestured to the door. "The night shift starts at 10. You can start there. If you want a real second chance, earn it. From the bottom up, the way he did." She wasn't firing him into oblivion. She was offering him a path, a difficult, humbling, but ultimately redemptive path. The chance to become the man his father always hoped he would be. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a storm of emotions, shame, shock, and for the first time something else, respect. He slowly, shakily stood up and walked out of the boardroom without another word, leaving his ambition and his arrogance scattered on the floor like the coffee he had spilled just one day before. Elena Sterling, the cleaner, who was now the chairwoman, stood at the head of the table, the morning sun framing her in a halo of light. She was home, and her husband's legacy was safe. There is a strength in quiet dignity that is more powerful than any shouting or screaming. Elena's story reminds us that true power isn't about the title you hold, but the character you show. If her story moved you, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will make you believe in the power of the human heart.